Pentalpha, a collection of 5 historical games. Actually, with all the variants in this box, you get 10 games. That's a pretty special deal. The word Pentalpha is a fairly recent moniker for this game, only a few hundred years old, but the game itself goes back many centuries. Let's start up the Wayback Machine. We'll go back to the ancient city of Thebes in Egypt. The Temple of Kurna was constructed between 1300 and 1200 BC by direction of the pharaoh Ramses I, carried on by his son Seti I. During the construction, the stonemasons carved some game boards into the stone building blocks of the temple. Among these carvings are pentagrams, the familiar 5-pointed star. This might have just been stonemasons practicing their geometric skills, but the proximity to the carvings of known game boards strongly suggests that they played some kind of a game on that diagram. The Greeks tended to borrow ideas from the Egyptians, including their board games. In 1952, H.J.R. Murray published this famous history of board games, and in that book he interprets the Greek game pentagrammi as being a description of the pentagram. Yes, the pentagram is made up of 5 lines, but pentagrammi is a completely different game. But in 1938, a researcher named L.S. Sutherland saw this game being played on the Isle of Crete. The player has 9 markers and the pentagram board. The idea is to get all the markers onto the board by a series of 3-step turns. Step 1, place a marker on one of the empty points of the pentagram. Step 2, jump the marker over any adjacent point following the lines, whether that adjacent point is occupied or not. And step 3, land the marker in the empty point beyond the one jumped. That's a lot of words to describe a very simple sequence. Anyhow, if you play the right sequence of these 3-step turns, you can get all 9 markers onto the board and win the game. And this little game was called Pentalpha by the locals on the island of Crete. Whether that's the way the ancient Greeks played these games, we'll never know. But elsewhere on the planet, a very fundamental kind of jump and capture solitaire game was being played on the star-shaped board, and it's called Star Solitaire. Star Solitaire begins with the 10 points of the pentagram covered by markers. One random marker is removed, presumably as a challenge by a second party. And then the familiar jump and capture process is applied. The goal, as usual, is to remove all but one marker from the board. And like all the game's cousins, there are sequences that will win every time, regardless of which space is empty at the beginning. The game is in finding that sequence. The solitaire game apparently was developed independently in China, where it's called Lucky Star, in Chinese, of course. The game is recorded as being played in Spain in the 15th century, and they took it to the Indios in the New World when they colonized the Americas. It spread widely in North America, where it was called Ahola by the Papago tribe in Arizona, and it was called Akuyo by the Tewas in New Mexico. Oh, and by the way, this has nothing to do with the solitaire card game called Star Solitaire. Next we have a game that's called Lam Turki. This is described by both R.C. Bell and H.J.R. Murray, and it comes from the Bengala region of India. As usual, it has several different names depending on where you're from in India, but the essence of the game is a combination of Pentalpha, played in Crete, and the Star Solitaire game. However, I've noticed that if you search for the Lam Turki game on the line, you'll find mostly just Star Solitaire. So it depends on your sources, of course. And next on the list is a 2-player game, also from India, called Kaooa. Aside from the fact that it's got a really cool name, Kaooa, couldn't find much out about the history of the game. H.J.R. Murray mentioned in his book in 1952 about the Kaooa game, but in his description he calls one of the characters in the game a tiger, which is pretty typical of those Central Indian hunt games. But most of the descriptions I've found call it vultures and crows. This game begins with an empty pentagram. One player has a single peg called the vulture. The other player has 7 pegs called crows. First, the crow player places a crow on any vacant point on the board. Second, the vulture is placed on any vacant point on the board. Thirdly, another crow is placed on any vacant point on the board. From this point on, the vulture can be moved from point to point along the lines, or the vulture can jump over a crow and remove it from the game. The crows continue to place another crow on their turn until all the crows are on the board. At that point, they too can begin to move. The crow's objective is to trap the vulture so it cannot be moved. The vulture's objective is to capture 4 crows to win. That's the entire game, and it's a very simple version of the usual predator versus prey games. Unfortunately, this game is just too mechanical. Too wary players of such games will discover right off the bat that it can end in an endless back and forth kind of a loop. So there has to be more to the rule set than that. The idea that if you force somebody into a corner so that they can only move back and forth, then that's called an entrapment. But it basically relies entirely on one of the players making a mistake. Very much like a tic-tac-toe type of an arrangement. So some variations can be introduced to actually make more of a game out of it. Here's a few ideas. One idea is to add the center hole to the board and use the 5 connecting lines for movement. This adds some new options for movement, but not for jumping. So what if we add the other 5 lines to connect the center to the outer points of the star? Now there are more jumping options and more movement options. But does it improve the game? What if that center hole is a safe space for the crows? They can't be jumped over while they sit there. The vulture can still use the space but not jump over it. But now with this many movement options, maybe there's room for a second vulture. These are all playable options, I suppose, but now it's not Kaooa. Now let's talk about the 5th game in this box. That's Lone Star. Unlike the other games, Lone Star is an invented game. Lone Star was actually patented by Charles Rickert in 1892. Whether he published the game or not is hard to say. I haven't found any reference to it in any collection books or anything. In fact, the only published version prior to this one that I could find online was an eBay listing for a Lone Star that was published by the Star Company in Nebraska. But anyhow, the seller of the copy on eBay was kind enough to show a really nice clear picture of the rules from the inside of the box top. And here's how that went. The Lone Star game included rules for several games inside the box top. The first and foremost is a solitaire game, pretty much like the basic pentagram version, but with 30 pegs using all the holes on the board. The ultimate win is to end up with the last peg in the center hole. A tough challenge. Oddly, the rules would allow jumping around corners, like at angles, in addition to straight lines. I'm sure this would make it easier to win, but trickier to work out all the possible jumping patterns. I think I'll stick with straight line jumping rules, which they titled For Experts and Smarties. But I like the 2-player version. This game begins with all the positions filled except the center hole. All moves are jump and capture moves, single adjacent pieces only following the lines, and all chain jumps are encouraged, but not apparently mandatory. In fact, chain jumping is the only logical strategy, so each player takes turns jumping and capturing until they can't, or until they just want to end their turn. The winner is the last player to be able to jump a peg on their turn. It sounds to me a lot like a star-shaped version of Konane, which is a really good game for 2 players. But in Konane, each player has their own color pegs. So there are a lot of game possibilities in this little box for Pentalpha and all of its cousins. It's been suggested that this board could be used for other games as well, probably something like a 9 Men's Morris 3-in-a-row game where you are forming mills to capture an opponent's pieces. I haven't tried it myself, and it might already exist, I'm not sure, but if you come up with something in that vein, share it with us here in the comments. I'd be very interested to see how that works. Another possibility was a 3-in-a-row game more like Picaria or Aki, that your objective is to simply form a row of 3, but then once your pieces are placed, you can move them about. I also found an interesting modern game called the pentagram. It's listed on the Board Game Geek database. A lot of spaces on this board, and I didn't have a chance to really study it, but the pentagram is still a very interesting shape and a lot of different applications. But I will not be held responsible if the use of this symbol results in any paranormal activity. The outcome of this game may be written in the stars, but whatever you play, be sure to play every day. Just as I was putting the final mix on this here video, I discovered one more incarnation of the Star game that I want to share with you. This Star game right here was an incarnation of the Lone Star game as an advertising gimmick for Charles H. Rickart's Cash Shoe Store in Reading, Pennsylvania. As you may recall from earlier in the video, Charles Rickert actually patented this game in 1892. Many thanks to robspuzzlepage.com for this information. It's a fascinating resource for anybody interested in particularly peg puzzles. And I definitely encourage you to go check out Rob's page. Thanks, Rob.